All right, what's going on, everyone? So, a new article just came out in Foreign Affairs that's going to be kind of an uncomfortable read for a lot of people. It's not something they necessarily want to see, but I think it's an important topic and worth discussing. So, the title of the article is Will the West Abandon Ukraine? Kyiv must prepare for a possible change of heart in America and Europe. And I know a lot of people don't want to hear that, don't want to suggest that that's even a possibility, but take the current context out of it. Historically, in the United States, we have a lot of examples where we have funded allies for a period of time and then we've moved on. Some say later than we should have, others say earlier than we should have. But I think it is important to at least have the conversation and recognize where this could be going. And one of the things the article gets into is what that could mean for Ukraine. Starting out, they say a coalition of the world's wealthiest and most technologically advanced countries gives Ukraine a major structural advantage. Russia, by contrast, only has two countries, Iran and North Korea, openly assisting with its war. Now, there is a little bit, and they get into this, there's a little bit of help kind of coming from China. China's not providing overt military aid to Russia, but they are continuing to kind of help support the Russian economy. And there's a lot of non-lethal equipment flowing into Russia that could over time be used on the military front. So they do still have China there as well. They say, yet Western military support comes with its own risks and challenges. One is Ukraine's extreme dependence on Western military and financial assistance. And I think anybody who's been following this war since the very beginning has recognized that. You know, there is a major imbalance here. Yes, Russia does have some assistance from North Korea. It sounds like they might potentially be getting some weaponry from North Korea. China still hasn't done that. There have been some arms shipments from Iran, especially earlier in the war, talking about these Shahed drones. But some of the larger munitions didn't materialize. There were some cruise missiles and short-range ballistic missiles from Iran that don't appear to have ever made it into Russia. By and large, however, the Russian military is largely being supported domestically. And, you know, it's two very different situations. Ukraine's military is by and large being supported internationally. So, you know, I would say that Ukraine has the ability to get more weaponry faster at a cheaper cost, kind of. But Russia is not going to turn off their own supply of ammunition, right? And Ukraine runs the risk that something happens in one of these countries and their supply line completely snaps. So they say continued Western commitment to Ukraine cannot be guaranteed. Political constituencies in Europe and the United States are questioning long-term support for Ukraine. So far, such voices remain in the minority, but they are multiplying and becoming louder. And I don't know what the solution is here, right? We've got a short attention span in a lot of ways, and the article is going to get into this, but you know, the longer this drags out, the longer this fight goes on, it's not going to be front page news. It's not going to be the focus of debates, right? And I can see the argument both sides. On the one hand, some people might say, good, if it's not the focus, then more supplies can be kind of sent under the radar. I mean, we provide weaponry to countries all around the world every single year, and there's no debate about it. There's no articles about what we sent to Saudi Arabia, right? There's rarely any articles about the aid and the equipment we send to Israel. It's kind of under the radar. It just kind of happens. There's one possibility that it goes that direction. The other possibility is it falls off the radar and people have no desire to keep it going. They say in the United States, the war in Ukraine has become the latest flashpoint in the fight over how much Americans should care and spend on supporting overseas partners and allies. In Europe, the COVID-19 pandemic and high inflation in the wake of the war have exerted economic pressure. Optimism about Ukraine's success has begun to waver, leading to uneasiness about a major open-ended war on European soil. That is a very, very hard sell to anybody. And they give some good examples here. And one of the challenges with the indefinite continuing of aid to Ukraine is there's a lot of other things going on. And it's very hard to look at something that, you know, in the United States, more in the United States, and that's, you know, I can speak to that a little more confidently than in Europe. It's very hard to point to, you know, your standard of living today in the United States as an American and why sending more of anything to Ukraine is going to help you in the short term, right? It's a strategic conversation that plays out over years or even decades. It's not something that hits someone's pocketbook or someone's wallet next week, right? If we stop sending aid to Ukraine, the price of gas doesn't go down tomorrow. So it's an understandable argument, but it's also a very difficult one to play out over the long term, to say we're just going to keep doing this indefinitely. Continuing, they say, meanwhile, developments on the front lines have emboldened skeptics of Western support for Kyiv. Ukraine's advocates do not have a clear, agreed-on theory of victory, which presents a political liability. The longer the conflict continues, the more the David and Goliath struggle of its early days will fade into the background, fueling a perception of futility and bolstering calls to at least find a cosmetic solution. I think that is spot on. I imagine that most of the people watching this video are those that are generally keeping up with the war. And honestly, if you're watching this video and you've watched one other video about Ukraine in the past week, you're probably in the 1% of at least Americans that are focusing on this type of event. Most, we just move on. You know, when you can't see the immediate impact to your day-to-day life, and it's hard to blame people, right? We all have so many things in our day-to-day that take our energy and time and cost us money and whatever else it might be. So many other priorities. The longer this goes, the more that David and Goliath struggle fades into the background. And I think it's just natural that people aren't going to place support for Ukraine in as high of a priority as they have in the past. They say if a sudden shift does occur in terms of aid not flowing into Ukraine, however, it will start in the United States, where the basic direction of U.S. foreign policy will be held on the ballot in November 2024. And we've kind of started to see this. You know, the very first Republican presidential debate that we had just a few weeks ago, and we've got another one coming up in a few weeks. But that first one of the two kind of foreign policy questions was about aid for Ukraine. And it was direct, like, will you continue supporting aid for Ukraine, that kind of thing. So it's 100% going to be on the ballot in that sense. I don't know how many people are going to vote based off of that topic, but what they're going to get into here in a minute is that some of the leading contenders have signaled that, you know, continued aid might be coming to an end. Shifting over to Europe, they say that undiminished devotion to Ukraine characterizes the governments of Finland, Poland, Sweden, the United Kingdom, and the Baltic states, adding that staunch European support seems unlikely to buckle soon. According to a June survey by Eurobarometer, 64% of EU residents support financing the purchase and supply of military equipment to Ukraine, ranging from 30% in Bulgaria to 93% in Sweden. 93%. Good for you, Sweden. I don't know the last time we had anything in the United States 93%, agreed upon. That is kind of jealous in a sense. You guys can all get on board of anything to that degree. They say that many European publics have become more supportive of the EU and NATO since the war began. I'm not sure how tied in that last sentence is. More support for the EU, more support for NATO doesn't automatically translate to more weapons to Ukraine. I thought it was worth bringing up. I would say at the very least, the Russian invasion of Ukraine has made many more people aware of the European Union and NATO. Right? There's people talking about NATO today like they know everything about it that probably hadn't heard the acronym 3 or 4 years ago. Right? So it's an awareness, 100%, if nothing else. They say, nevertheless, a kind of fatigue is taking its toll on Europe. The best example of this can be found in Germany, which has survived an energy bottleneck caused by the war and accepted 1 million Ukrainian refugees while gradually increasing its assistance to Ukraine. They say that polling now places the AfD as Germany's second strongest party, who they say wants to withdraw Germany from NATO and halt support for Ukraine. But the party's popularity does not stem from its pro-Russian views. The AfD exploits general discontent to make its critique of Germany's Atlanticist foreign policy seem more mainstream. And this is something the article gets into that I think is really important. For a long time, anything suggesting reduced amount of aid to Ukraine was written off as pro-Russia. And I don't think that's always been the case, not by a long shot. I think there are people that just view that it shouldn't be the top priority. And there was actually a focus group on a podcast I listened to the other day, and they were asking Republican voters in New Hampshire questions about Ukraine. And they started and they said, who do you want to win this war? And every single one of them was like 10 people. Every one of them said Ukraine. They didn't miss a beat. And then they asked about continued aid, and each one of them said, look, we got other places to spend the money. So it's this weird mix, right? It's the messy feelings that we have as humans that people want Ukraine to win, but they don't necessarily want to sign on for indefinite aid forever into the future. They continue saying, and that's, again, we're talking about random sample sizes. That sample size I'm talking about was of a demographic in the United States. A lot of the Republican candidates, as we'll get into here in a minute, are signaling less support for Ukraine. So it's not crazy that that was the stance they took. I just thought it was worth bringing up because they were not pro-Russian. They had nothing positive to say about Russia. They just weren't necessarily on board with, the volume and frequency of aid going into Ukraine. Continuing on, they say, since support for the war is the status quo position in Europe, entrepreneurial politicians could focus on the home front and blame elites in capital cities and Brussels for caring more about Ukraine than their own populations, adding it would not take a particularly skilled demagogue to persuade those Europeans enduring economic pressures that an easy end to the war is avoidable and that ending it would deliver them from their woes, such as high inflation. It's kind of what I was getting at there. It's become such the norm, and it's changing a little bit here in the United States, where I feel like we're starting to see more debate. Whether you think that's a good thing or a bad thing, it does seem like it's more in the conversation than it was, say, a year ago. When some of those early aid packages to Ukraine went, there was really no conversation. You just kind of woke up and bam, it's out the door. It is becoming more of a conversation, and I think they make a very good point that there are so many other challenges that just happen to people around the world. If somebody wants to separate themselves from the mainstream, if you will, it's very easy to say, I'm going to stop that thing and focus on you. And let's be honest, like that's going to have a strong draw to a lot of people. Moving into the United States and the support in the United States, they say the wild card in the war is the United States. In recent months, talking about the candidates on the ticket, saying that Trump and previous President Trump and current President Biden are pretty much neck and neck in a lot of polling. So they say in recent months, Trump has suggested that he could end the war in Ukraine in 24 hours. Such campaign bluster suggests that Trump would prefer a negotiated settlement to the conflict, most likely on Russian terms, to the steady continuation of aid and assistance to Ukraine. I kind of have mixed feelings on that. I don't like that they added in most likely on Russian terms when talking about a negotiated settlement. That's kind of been the consensus, is that any sort of negotiation in the near term would have to be on Russian terms. But I also think that's kind of setting it up for failure. Right? If we go into it thinking that any sort of agreement is going to favor Russia, then anybody that doesn't want Russia to succeed in this war is going to be out. They're not going to have any desire to negotiate. So, maybe what Trump says he could propose would be on Russian terms, but I think for any of those things, it's a wait and see what that actually looks like before we label it necessarily one thing or the other. Continuing on, they say the Reaganite wing of the Republican Party, which supports a robust defense of allied democracies, remains well represented on Capitol Hill and in Washington think tanks, but among the Republican primary electorate, that vision is falling flat. The GOP base sees China as a far greater threat than Russia, and many Republicans see a trade-off between supporting Ukraine and addressing domestic problems. Again, and it goes back to what I was saying earlier about the pro-Russia sentiment. A lot of times when somebody says maybe we should relook the aid to Ukraine, that's not all rooted in necessarily Americans saying we want Putin to win. And there are some people, unfortunately, on the internet that I think take that stance because it's controversial and they draws clicks and draws views and all that stuff. Who knows if they actually believe it? But a far more common statement right now and stance is not supporting Russia, but saying, yeah, Ukraine's important and we want Ukraine to win and we feel awful for what they're going through, but we also need to take care of our own. And I think that has that's resonated with people throughout history, right? There's no reason that it wouldn't resonate in the coming 6, 12, 18 months. Quoting Republican presidential hopeful Vivek Ramaswamy, they say, quote, or Ramaswamy says, quote, "We're going out of our way to use U.S. military resources to defend an invasion of someone else's border when we're doing absolutely nothing to stop the cartel-aided invasion across our own southern border right here at home." The article says that statement has a strong intuitive appeal for many Republicans and conservatives. It likely resonates with many independents and even some Democrats and progressives. So again, the arguments here aren't crazy. What they just said was this statement by a presidential candidate resonates with Republicans, conservatives, independents, Democrats, and progressives. You just say everybody, right? Everybody wants to hear that things are affecting them. The things that are affecting them are being taken care of. So again, they're talking about that possibility in Europe and, of course, the very real possibility here in the near term in the United States. The article says that without Western backing, Ukraine would face two dilemmas. One would be the challenge of fighting the war if Western material became either more expensive, less forthcoming, or both. No brainer there, right? Aid shipments stop, weapons stop. It's going to be a very challenging fight for Ukraine in the very near term. They said if Europe or the United States or both were to cut off aid to Ukraine, it would amount to an incalculable loss of military prowess. I don't think that's up in the air. I don't think that's a surprise. I don't think that's anything that people didn't already know, but worth saying it. They say the other dilemma would extend beyond Ukraine. Western support for Ukraine and Russian self-perception are deeply intertwined. Putin's invasion was not just a wager that Ukraine would fall and that Russia would then control or partition the country. It was a wager about the West, and in particular, the United States. They say Putin was betting against the strategic acumen and patience of the United States and that of NATO. Were the United States and fellow NATO members to lose patience in Ukraine, the Kremlin might well declare the war a strategic triumph, even if Russia remained mired in conflict in Ukraine, and it might be seen globally as a triumph for Moscow. But let's be honest, if you look back at the Russian invasion of 2014 into Crimea and the Donbass, the world, for the most part, just kind of looked the other way. I mean, right? Like, it was an invasion. Russia occupied territories of Ukraine, and really nothing happened, right? So it's not shocking that Putin looked at that and said, hey, maybe the same thing will happen again. He miscalculated, at least in the short term, as arms shipments started to flow in and military cooperation began to happen with NATO member states all around the world. But you could see where if NATO, the United States, and all these countries lose interest in Ukraine, it could be viewed as a strategic victory for Putin. I mean, again, it's so easy to think about the very near term and how the lines shift over the next coming days and weeks, but what about 50 years from now? If we look back and NATO steps away from this conflict after 18 months and stops supplying Ukraine, it's going to look like, this whole episode might be painted as a good thing for Russia, as a positive decision, as Putin made the right move. He understood that we wouldn't last 2 years of all-out support, right? So if you think about the long term, it's still undecided. Continuing, they say that should support for Ukraine fade in Europe but not in the United States, Russia would pursue a divide-and-conquer approach. The idea would be to drive a wedge between some European governments and Washington and between Eastern and Western Europe. You see that. I mean, there's already been a lot of tension between a lot of allies over this war. I think a lot of it's been behind the scenes, but every so often you see the leak and it comes out and there's some heated exchanges, right, between friendly nations. If one of them were to make a big decision, like to stop assisting Ukraine in this war, I think that would just increase tension between some of these countries, and Russia would be silly to not try to exploit that, right? But shifting over to the other side here, they say a loss of support from the United States and not in Europe. So Europe continues supporting the United States, either slows or stops entirely. They say would have a more dramatic effect. U.S. military commitments match all of the EU's combined military pledges for Ukraine. Europe cannot substitute for U.S. military assistance on such a large scale. If the United States tried to force a negotiated settlement on Ukraine, Europeans would have little capacity to resist. I'm a little skeptical of that. Some of these, the idea that Poland, for instance, would just say, or the United Kingdom even right now, some pretty hawkish NATO members when it comes to this war, that would look at, a negotiated settlement that the United States drums up and sits idly by. I just don't see that happening. It doesn't mean that either country could necessarily, over the next few weeks and months, ramp up their defense production to really keep Ukraine in the fight in the same way as when the United States is providing the quantity of aid that we have. But, there would be a lot of pushback, I feel. Maybe not across all of NATO, but there's a handful of NATO member states that would really, really push, in my opinion, maybe successfully, maybe not, at any sort of negotiated settlement kind of directed by Washington. They get into something here called Putin's secret weapon as they kind of wrap up. They say the Ukrainian government should cultivate relationships with political figures and parties that are not strongly in Ukraine's camp, including parties on the far left and the far right. Much as the Ukrainian government has developed ties with China during the war, despite China's proximity to Russia. I can't tell how much that's happened or hasn't happened in the United States. I mean, we've had political figures from both sides of the aisle traveling to Ukraine, and we've had politicians from both sides of the aisle kind of step up and support aid to Ukraine. So I'm not exactly sure where that would need to be directed, but it makes sense, right? You can't court one political party for something that's going to be dragging on for at least another few years. They say all foreign policy choices should be put to the test of elections, but some priorities can be safeguarded. Financial support and security guarantees for Ukraine can be included in legislation and embedded in far-sighted budgets. I don't know. I feel like that would get a lot of pushback right now. This feels very much the sentiment around foreign aid, not just for Ukraine, but foreign aid in general within the United States is becoming more controversial. And, I know we have this with some other nations. It's been written in for a long time, but I think trying to get that into something that's airtight and locks in aid or support for Ukraine for even 5 years, I feel like that would meet as much resistance. I feel like that would just meet a lot of resistance. I don't know. I understand what the authors are getting at here. Stop making this a month-to-month, election cycle to election cycle. I don't know. I feel like that would meet a lot of resistance here in the United States. I get what the authors are pointing to here. Stop making this a month-to-month, election cycle to election cycle type debate. It's something that needs to be locked in. It's so important that it needs to be locked in long-term. I don't know. That doesn't feel very realistic here in the United States. It feels like the winds are changing enough and so frequently that something like that would be met with an awful lot of pushback. They say that as the conflict lingers, Ukraine will have to adapt its narrative of the war for Western publics. Instead of a quick and decisive victory, as many had hoped for when the summer counteroffensive was first launched, Kyiv will need to explain the end game of a prolonged war, which remains the survival of Ukraine. 100% agree. I think far too long, and everybody's guilty of this, right? Every country, I should say. This is not like a knock on Ukraine or a knock on the United States or anybody. It's every time a weapon shipment is sent over and there's talk about F-16s or there's talks about ATACMS or anything like that, it's presented and talked about like it's going to drastically alter the nature of the fight. And every time one of these things enters the theater, it does change the fight, right? It gives Ukraine additional capabilities. But I feel like somehow that translates to people as this could be the thing that ends the war. And there hasn't been a single thing yet. There's nothing that we're going to send Ukraine that's going to end the war. And I agree. I think there needs to be more discussion about the fact that this is going to go on for a long time. Just to be blunt. How long? We don't know. But it's not going to be over fast. They say that in 2015, after the worst of the fighting in eastern Ukraine ended after a flawed ceasefire deal, the cardinal error of the West was to lose interest. Somehow the crisis was supposed to take care of itself. From this, Putin learned what he took to be an essential truth about the fickleness of Western leaders. Look, I don't know how you solve that problem. The cardinal error of the West was to lose interest. We lose interest in things that directly affect us every single week. We're flawed. We make mistakes. We're human. I don't think it's realistic that a war on foreign soil can be kept front of mind for the vast majority of people in another country indefinitely. Maybe that's pessimistic, but again, there's things that directly affect us every single day here in the United States, and we stop talking about it after a week. So it just seems like a big ask. I don't know that that's very realistic. And finally, they say that Western indifference and impatience are Putin's ultimate weapons in this war. Without them, Putin faces a strategic dead end. So, if I had to assign some sort of prescription here, I don't know that keeping the American public interested in this indefinitely is the way to go. Just, again, there's nothing we stay interested in all that long. And it's not just the United States. I know this is a global thing. If it's not directly impacting you, it's hard to stay focused and really dialed in and prioritize it over things that do affect our day-to-day and our health and our well-being and our families and things like that. I think the way to do this is kind of part of what the authors were saying earlier, solidify this in stone and lock in support for a long time. Do that early, right? The minute when you've got the spark, and so many people in the country were watching, and there were Ukrainian flags waving on streets, and it was front page news for days on end. That was the time period to lock this in and say, well, we're going to support Ukraine. If that was the decision, we're going to support Ukraine for the next 10 years. And here's what aid packages over the next decade look like. That was the time. You had the political capital, you had the interest from the people. That's when you make these big decisions. That's when you can get things done for a long period of time. But as we've waited and as this has drug on, to me, we've now put ourselves in a position where this is going to be a debate every election cycle. And not just election cycles here in the United States, but every election cycle in Europe, in NATO countries. That's, the position we put ourselves in. So maybe next time around, a major conflict or a major event like this kicks off, if we can be very deliberate, and I know there's a lot of risk that comes with this, but if we can be very deliberate and lay out a long-term plan, while the iron is hot and people are paying attention and there's an interest and a desire to get those things done, maybe we can avoid what they say is the cardinal error of the West in losing interest. But that's all I got for now. Again, this article will be linked in the description below, along with the national security sit reps that I put out on Substack. Each week, direct to your inbox, 7 to 10 of the top national security stories, summarized with links out to read more about each if interested. But thanks for watching. I'll see y'all next time.